he was missing that in the James Gang because we're a group.
Right.
In December 1971, the James Gang stood at the absolute summit of American rock. 2 gold albums in 3 years, sold-out tours across the country, a signature riff that made every FM radio station in America light up with requests. Pete Townshend of The Who had personally taken them under his wing. Their power trio sound, raw, muscular, distinctly Midwestern, had proven that a band from Cleveland could stand toe-to-toe with anything coming out of London or San Francisco. And then, without warning, their guitarist walked away. Not because of a fight, not because of drugs or money or creative battles that exploded backstage. Joe Walsh left because success itself had become a cage. The very format that had made them unique, 3 men, no safety net, nowhere to hide, had become a limitation he could no longer endure. What followed was 6 years of confusion. Talented musicians cycled through, each trying to fill a space that couldn't be filled. Albums continued to be released, but the identity was gone. The audience drifted away, and all the while, the man who had been their center went on to conquer the world with the Eagles, a constant reminder of what the James Gang had lost. This is the story of how a band forged by accident became one of America's premier rock acts, then disappeared into silence, while their former guitarist became a legend. This is a story told through 7 turning points, 7 moments that defined their rise, their dominance, and their quiet, inevitable collapse. How does a band lose itself while the music is still playing? Level 1. Origins and the accident that forged everything. Cleveland, Ohio, 1966. While San Francisco drowned in psychedelic experimentation and London refined the British blues movement, a different sound was being forged in America's industrial heartland. The James Gang emerged from a city built on steel mills and automotive plants, and their music would carry that same blue-collar grit. Raw, powerful, unpolished, honest. Drummer Jim Fox was the architect. He was the James of the gang, the organizer, the man with the vision. Fox assembled musicians from the local Ohio scene with a singular purpose: create a harder, leaner American rock sound that could stand equal to the British invasion bands they admired. They drew from the British blues movement, certainly, but filtered it through something distinctly Midwestern, something that reflected the working-class neighborhoods they came from, something urgent and real. The crucial piece fell into place in January 1968, when a young guitarist named Joe Walsh joined the fold. Walsh wasn't just another player. He was a technical wizard who had studied music at Kent State University, a kid who understood music theory but possessed the raw instinct to know exactly when to throw it all away and just play. He brought formal training and street-level intuition in equal measure, a rare combination that would prove essential to everything that followed. But the real transformation, the accident that would define their entire identity, happened later that same year, just before a crucial gig opening for Cream at Detroit's legendary Grand Ballroom. A band member abruptly quit. The reasons are lost to history. What matters is the choice that faced the remaining musicians: cancel the show and lose their shot at the big time, or go out there as a 3-piece and make it work. They chose to make it work. That forced power trio format wasn't some artistic statement conceived in a rehearsal room. It was pure survival, born from necessity in a moment of crisis. But necessity became innovation. With no rhythm guitarist to fill the space, no keyboards to add texture or cushion, Walsh had to completely reimagine his approach to the instrument. He developed a muscular, riff-heavy style, pioneering the use of effects like the Echoplex and Leslie rotating speaker to create a sound that was massive, urgent, and unmistakably his own. That high-gain tone wasn't manufactured in some comfortable studio session. It was forged under pressure, born from the need to compensate for what they didn't have. This was the blue-collar work ethic made sonic. This was American resourcefulness turned into art. 3 men in a room with nowhere to hide and everything to prove. The James Gang wasn't a band handed success by some record label executive with a marketing plan. This was a band that earned every note the hard way, shaped by circumstance into something no one had quite heard before. Level 2, building the sound and proving it could work. The proof arrived in 1969 with their debut album. The title itself was a middle finger to pretension your album. Not a grand artistic statement, no flowery concept, just here's your album, take it or leave it. The record peaked at a modest number 83 on the Billboard 200, respectable but not spectacular. But something was building beneath the surface. The album proved the power trio concept worked in a recorded format. Walsh's innovative approach could carry an entire record without collapsing under the weight of that responsibility. The stripped-down arrangement forced clarity. Every note mattered because there was nowhere to hide a mistake. The sound was lean, direct, powerful, everything a power trio should be. Beauty Your Album was just the foundation. The real arrival came in 1970 with James Gang Rides Again. This time, the audience was ready. The album exploded, surging to number 20 on the Billboard 200, their first genuine breakthrough. This wasn't a fluke or a temporary curiosity. This was validation. The James Gang had arrived as a legitimate force in American rock. At the center of that success was a single track that would outlive everything else they ever recorded. The opening riff hit like a sledgehammer, distinctive, driving, immediately recognizable. Funk 49th was co-written by Walsh, Fox, and new bassist Dale Peters, who had replaced Tom Criss and solidified what would become the classic lineup. The song barely scraped the Hot 100, peaking at number 59, but that number is meaningless in the larger story. What mattered was the riff itself. That riff became a calling card, a signature, a sound that couldn't be mistaken for anyone else. Walsh himself later emphasized the raw authenticity of the recording. I don't think that there was any overdubbing. The only thing we really added was the percussion middle part, which the three of us actually played, putting some parts on top of the drums. No studio tricks, no manufactured polish, just three guys in a room making the sound they wanted to hear. The song structure was primarily instrumental, a showcase for Walsh's guitar prowess built entirely around that unforgettable lick. It became an immediate staple of the emerging FM radio scene, the kind of song that disc jockeys couldn't stop playing because listeners couldn't stop requesting it. Radio programmers understood what they had, something genuine, something powerful, something that connected. The validation came from an unexpected and meaningful source. Pete Townshend of The Who, after watching the James Gang open for them in 1969, was so impressed that he publicly praised Walsh and took the American Trio under his wing. Coming from Townshend, one of rock's most respected and innovative guitarists, that endorsement carried enormous weight. Here's what's particularly telling about James Gang Rides Again. The album went gold while the single barely cracked the top 60. This dynamic proves they weren't chasing pop success or trying to manufacture radio hits. They were building something deeper, a devoted rock audience that bought albums, not just singles. They were an album-oriented rock band in the truest sense, and their fans understood that the real power existed in the full experience, not the 3-minute radio edit. The James Gang had proven that a band from Cleveland, from America's industrial heartland, could compete with anyone. The sound had arrived fully formed and undeniable, and for a brief, brilliant moment, everything seemed possible. Level 3, the peak in the golden run. What happened next was a run that most bands never experience. Between 1970 and 1973, the James Gang released a blistering series of albums that cemented their status as one of America's premier hard rock acts. The classic lineup, Walsh, Fox, and Peters, had found their rhythm, and they attacked the moment with relentless momentum. Thirds, released in April 1971, continued the upward trajectory, peaking at number 27 on the Billboard 200. It produced Walk Away, which became their highest charting single, reaching number 51. The reviews were strong, the sales were consistent, and the live shows were explosive. The James Gang had become a headlining act, a band that could fill theaters and arenas on the strength of their reputation alone. James Gang live in concert, captured what made them truly dangerous. Released in September 1971, the album peaked at number 24 and documented their blistering stage presence. The raw energy, the extended jams, the way Walsh could take a single riff and stretch it into something transcendent. The live album proved they weren't a studio creation. The power was real, immediate, undeniable when experienced in person. But embedded within this triumph was a detail that, in hindsight, reads like a warning. The liner notes 4/3 credited Joe Walsh with guitar, vocals, and train wreck on Walk Away. It wasn't just a quirky joke. Walsh later explained how he achieved that chaotic sound by literally throwing his guitar and jumping on it, pushing the instrument to the point of destruction to get the noise he wanted. Success wasn't enough. Commercial validation wasn't enough. Walsh needed more space, more freedom, more creative territory than the power trio format could provide. The fact that his chaos was immortalized on the album cover should have been the signal. The train wreck wasn't just a sound effect, it was a prophecy. For 3 years, the James Gang dominated their corner of the rock world. They played sold-out shows across the country. They moved units consistently. They proved that a band from the Rust Belt could compete with anyone coming out of the cultural centers on the coasts. The gold albums validated everything they had worked for, but the very structure that had made them unique, the power trio forced by necessity back in 1968, was becoming a cage. And Joe Walsh, the man who had built that sound, who had pioneered the techniques that made it work, was starting to feel the walls closing in. The peak was real, the success was undeniable, the audience was devoted, but the foundation was already cracking and nobody saw it coming. Level 4, the departure that changed everything. December 1971. The James Gang stood at the height of their commercial power. Gold albums, sold-out tours, critical respect, radio dominance, everything pointed toward more success, bigger stages, greater heights. And then Joe Walsh walked away, not because the band had failed, not because of creative differences that exploded into screaming matches, not because of drugs or money or ego clashes that tore the group apart. Walsh left because success itself had become the problem. The very identity that made the James Gang matter, the power trio stripped down to raw essentials, had become a limitation he could no longer tolerate. Walsh relocated to Boulder, Colorado, with producer Bill Simchick to pursue new musical territory. Contemporary accounts noted that Walsh was consistently managing to dodge or postpone superstardom, always seeking creative divergence when things got too comfortable. His initial solo project, Barnstorm, retained the trio format at first, but quickly integrated keyboards and embraced a more melodic, country-influenced West Coast style. Walsh later explained the constraint he had been feeling. As the only melodic instrument in the James Gang, he had to do everything: carry the riffs, handle the solos, fill the space, maintain the energy. There was no room to breathe, no space to experiment with softer textures or different sounds. The power trio demanded constant intensity, and Walsh needed something more, something gentler, something that allowed for dynamics and shading. For Jim Fox and Dale Peters, Walsh's departure created an immediate and devastating vacuum. This wasn't like losing a bass player or a drummer, positions that could be filled by competent professionals. Walsh was the sound. He was the riffs that defined their hits. He was the voice. He was the innovative guitar techniques that made them distinctive. The James Gang had been built on a deliberate restriction that maximized Walsh's singular genius. And now that genius was gone, the remaining core faced an impossible task: find a replacement for a guitarist whose identity had completely fused with the band's. How do you replace the irreplaceable? How do you maintain an identity built entirely around someone else's vision? The answer, as it turned out, was that you couldn't. But Fox and Peters were going to spend the next 6 years trying. Walsh's exit wasn't a betrayal, it was an evolution, a natural progression for an artist who needed more room to grow. But for the James Gang, it was the beginning of the end. The train wreck Walsh had created on thirds was nothing compared to the slow-motion crash that was about to consume the band he left behind. Level 5. The identity crisis and the carousel of replacements. The confusion started immediately. Fox and Peters, determined to keep the James Gang alive, recruited Canadian guitarist Dominic Troiano and vocalist Roy Kinner in 1972. Troiano was talented, a skilled player with a funk rock influence that offered something different from Walsh's blues-based approach. It wasn't an attempt to clone what they'd lost. It was an honest effort to move forward with a new identity. 2 albums followed in quick succession, Straight Shooter and Passin' Through. On paper, it looked like continuity. The James Gang was still recording, still touring, still functioning as a professional operation. The machinery kept running, but the numbers told a different story. Straight Shooter peaked at number 58. Passin' Through peaked at number 72. The commercial trajectory was reversing sharply. The audience was still there, but something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't the James Gang they remembered. It was decent, competent, professionally executed, but it wasn't the same. Then came another lineup change that pushed the band even further from its origins. In 1973, Troiano was replaced by Tommy Bolin, a young, highly experimental guitarist who would later join Deep Purple. Bolin was a virtuoso, genuinely gifted. But his style incorporated jazz fusion and Miles Davis influences, sophisticated, subtle, often at odds with the hard-charging blues rock foundation the band was built on. The albums produced during the Bolin era struggled severely. Bang! Released in 1973, peaked at number 122. Miami, released in 1974, peaked at number 97. These weren't just disappointing numbers, they were evidence of freefall. The band was desperately trying different styles and directions, but unable to find solid ground. This rapid stylistic carousel, from blues rock to funk to jazz fusion, confirmed what fans already sensed. The James Gang had lost its identity. They were no longer a band with a clear vision. They had become a vehicle for talented musicians who didn't quite fit the space they were trying to fill. Critics began to settle on a consensus, brutal in its simplicity. Since Joe Walsh, the critical darling, left the band, nobody really cared much about it. And that's the tragedy embedded in those words. It wasn't that Troiano or Bolin were bad musicians. They were exceptionally talented, bringing their own skills and ideas to the table. But they weren't trying to be Joe Walsh. They were trying to be themselves within a structure that had been built for someone else. The James Gang name carried expectations they couldn't meet, and the constant comparisons to the Walsh era made every album feel like a failure regardless of its actual quality. The audience that had made the James Gang successful wasn't interested in experimentation or evolution. They wanted that stripped-down, muscular power trio sound. They wanted the riffs that shook their car speakers. They wanted the identity that had made the band matter in the first place. And no matter how many talented musicians cycled through, that identity was gone forever. Level 6, the quiet collapse and the silent ending, the end came. Quietly. There was no dramatic breakup announcement, no farewell tour, no final statement explaining why it was over. Just diminishing returns and the slow realization that the fight was no longer worth fighting. The James Gang's final album, Jesse Come Home, released in 1976 with Bob Webb on guitar, failed to chart at all, not even the bottom of the Billboard 200. The silence was deafening. The James Gang released their final, unsuccessful album. Walsh and the Eagles were selling millions of records and playing stadium tours across the globe. The contrast was brutal. Every time Walsh succeeded, it reminded the world what the James Gang had lost. Every Eagles album that went multi-platinum was proof that the center they couldn't replace was, in fact, irreplaceable. The James Gang had become a footnote to Joe Walsh's story, when once he had been the centerpiece of theirs. Fox and Peters couldn't compete with that shadow. They had done everything they could, but the audience had made its choice. They wanted Joe Walsh, and if they couldn't have him with the James Gang, they would follow him wherever he went. The James Gang ended not with a bang, but with a whisper, a slow fade into silence while the world moved on. Level 7, the legacy that endures. Decades later, The perspective shifts. The confusion of the post-Walsh years has been stripped away by time, leaving behind the powerful, concentrated output of the band's peak. The legacy isn't about how they ended. It's about what they were when it mattered. The riffs endure. Funk 49th remains an indispensable staple of classic rock radio, played thousands of times a week across the country. Walk Away still captures that perfect combination of melody and muscle. The songs don't sound dated. They sound foundational, like the building blocks that every hard rock band since has borrowed from, consciously or not. Joe Walsh's innovations during his time with the James Gang, his pioneering use of a quite be rebuilt. It's about the difference between competence and magic, between a good band and a great one. For 3 years, from 1970 to 1973, the James Gang had something that belonged only to them. A sound forged by accident and necessity. A power trio stripped down to its essential elements. 3 musicians from Cleveland who proved that American rock and roll could be just as powerful, just as innovative as anything coming from London. The collapse couldn't erase what they built during those years. The failed experiments and lineup changes couldn't diminish the achievement of those first albums. The past can still be perfect even when the ending wasn't. The music endures. The riffs echo across decades, through car speakers and headphones, at classic rock concerts and tribute shows, and somewhere, on a highway at midnight, Funk 49th is still shaking someone's car speakers, still making them remember what it felt like to be young and alive when rock and roll mattered most. The James Gang proved that sometimes the greatest success contains the seeds of its own destruction. The gold albums couldn't prevent the identity crisis that met them when their center walked away. But decades later, what remains isn't the confusion or the failed experiments. It's the riffs that defined a generation. Do you remember when the James Gang still sounded like the James Gang? Drop your memories in the comments below. And if this story brought back something you'd forgotten, consider subscribing for more stories from rock's golden era. The music may have ended, but the memories never will.